So this was the week where the Penelakut Tribe in British Columbia announced they had found 160 graves in the southern Gulf Island, which was once home to the Kuper Island Residential School, who survivors have referred to as the Canadian Alcatraz. Many of the deaths were from children who were trying to escape this school and swim to anywhere else and died. This is on top of the 182 human remains found outside of a school in Cranbrook, British Columbia, and 2 other church-run schools, one of more than 600 unmarked graves at the Maryville Residential School in Saskatchewan, and another of 250 bodies outside of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I believe, Clayton, you can tell me more, but is a commission set up by the Canadian government, has reported more than 4,000 Indigenous children in residential schools dying from either neglect or abuse. Clayton, just your reaction to all of this, and maybe if you can shed light on if you know why we're finding out, why these graves are being discovered now. The atrocities we know have been going on, that has been documented, but why now?
Well, I think for everybody tuned in, that's going to watch the cast later, it's important to understand that residential schools have not ended. They've just changed the way that they look within the system of the settler colonial state, whether it's the United States of America or Canada or other settler colonial states where they had church-run work camps where they would steal the children and partner with schools to, quote, the first Prime Minister of Canada, educate the Indian from the child, to kill the Indian from the child. And, it was interesting yesterday here in my province in Manitoba, the Minister of Indian Affairs and Reconciliation resigned, the day before. And 10 minutes into the swearing in of the new minister, who actually happened to be Métis, was sworn in by the premier of our province, which is like the governor in the United States. And basically, this guy within 10 minutes started defending residential schools during this time where thousands and thousands of unmarked graves are being discovered, and where there are tens of thousands of Indigenous peoples who survived, and we should be celebrating them and telling their stories, right? They survived, and they got to listen to this guy because it was on the national news. And, my colleague, the leader of the NDP opposition party here in our provincial legislature, interrupted the press conference. This guy named Wab Canoe, he's Anishinaabe, and he's the son of residential school survivors, as am I, and as are many from my generation. It was just a really painful thing to hear this elected leader defending residential schools when we've had a tens of millions of dollar government study, to create 94 recommendations for truth and reconciliation over 100 years of the abduction of children by the Royal Mounted Canadian Police, which is the equivalent of the FBI in the United States. They were created to literally enforce residential school policy and go into First Nations and steal kids.
Chilling. That is frightening.
Oh yeah, and it happened in the States too, and
right.
So there has been independent studies and pressure on the federal government of Canada, on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his cabinet. Deb Haaland, big fists up to the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, who is Indigenous, for calling on an investigation of every U.S. Concentration camp for Indian kids. That's what these schools were, as part of an apartheid policy, to use ground penetrating radar to identify unmarked graves, because, the way the government of Canada, whether it was a conservative or a central or a leftist party running the government over the last 150 years, has all said the same thing. And that is that, oh yeah, a lot of kids died from tuberculosis. These are mass graves, but they're not, and you match what is currently being unearthed with the testimony of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they interviewed tens of thousands of survivors of these schools, where the federal government of Canada literally had to apologize, class action lawsuit. My mom was one of those people. She got a little bit of money, but the process she had to go through to get that, that little tiny bit of money for what she experienced, through this cultural genocide, was a re-traumatizing. And now we've got this as a political football. Canada is going into a federal election at some point here in the next month or two, and we see these conservative assholes, trying to make this political. Like, there was a protest last week here in Winnipeg, where I live, where Native people ripped down the statue of Queen Victoria, who signed the original Indian treaties here in Canada, back in the birth of this settler colonial state. They ripped the statue down, and the premier in my province, Brian Palliser, instead of just being like reverent and like, whoa, I understand where these people are coming from, he's like, yo, we're going to persecute every one of these people. And he basically like denied climate change. And that's why the former Minister of Indian Affairs resigned here, and this new asshole came on and tried to do this press conference, and the official leader of the opposition party, Wab Kinew, stepped up and shut his ass down and was like, I am a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an honorary member, and I cannot accept you saying these things and defending residential school when we've already won that debate. We know it was wrong. And
it's chilling to me because, and it's timely because we are now in this moment in the United States, which again, there were Indian residential schools, Native residential schools here in the States as well, but that where we're hearing like critical race theory is coming for you, that like this is, that's the cultural genocide, that's gonna, ruin our children. Meanwhile, we have, gravesite after gravesite after atrocity being discovered of literal genocide, of what it actually means to indoctrinate, to terrorize children with a specific racial superiority agenda in mind, and to think that some of these right wingers are probably like, well, if you teach about residential schools, that is racist in and of itself. I don't know whether the right in Canada is, I wasn't clear on whether you were saying that they were feeling like that's their line now.
Oh, no. Yeah. I mean, there is all kinds of deflection, and the rejection of his history. And, the fact of the matter is that, racists are afraid again. And I think that's the truth too, in the lower 48 and Alaska. And I think that, indigenous peoples, and we saw that with Standing Rock, we don't need the mainstream media anymore for our stories to cross over to, the so-called dominant society. And Native storytellers, indigenous innovators on digital platforms like what you're doing, reaching out in the world and, bringing together unlikely bedfellows to like make a freaking point about justice. I think is really powerful. And that's certainly happening in the Native community. And, with this residential school stuff, this is an unstoppable force. These are children that have been waiting to come home, be discovered. And from a Native worldview and cosmology perspective, it's like, I saw this painting that this youngster did. I think she might have been 8. And it went viral on Facebook, and it was all these children flying towards the sun out of these discovery points. And
oh, wow.
And for me as a father and as a global campaigner, like fighting for justice and, against colonialism, fighting for reparations, for those impacted by colonialism, and working towards healing for those of us that have post-traumatic stress from residential schools and the intergenerational impacts of that and the way that it affected our family. I feel very emotional about, this moment in time, because, these political decision makers, whether it's, climate change or an issue like this, they're just making it political and they're not actually doing anything. And, I shame Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, and I shame Joseph Biden, and any other leader of any of these settler colonial states that have not done right by the Native person, by the oldest brothers and sisters of all of the people that have come together in these settler colonial state melting pots. There is a healing and a reckoning that needs to happen that goes beyond apologies. And I feel very strongly that the spiritual force of these youngsters coming home, and the release that is allowing for the survivors. And for those of us that are children of survivors that have kids, it feels like that scene in that Marvel movie. I don't want to be a spoiler, but where one of the Marvel characters opens up this dead star to create this weapon to kill a evil person, and the star's energy blasts through them. That's how it feels to be a parent right now, a Native parent protecting your kids. And they all have freaking iPhones. They all see what's going on, but we're trying to protect them from the worst impacts of what the frick happened. And I think that what the viewers and listeners need to understand about this topic, and I'll end here, is that residential schools never closed. They're just called Child and Family Services now. And I don't know about the rest of like Turtle Island, North America, but here in Manitoba, there are more kids in care right now by non-Native families and living in hotels with social workers than there were in 150 years of residential school policy of kidnapping our children, cutting their hair when they speak their language. And so, the fight continues,
Yeah. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.